August 7th, 1983. Moscow, USSR, Yaroslavsky Station. Viktor Petrov steps onto the Trans-Siberian Railway with a briefcase chained to his wrist and a simple belief. 6,000 miles of Soviet land makes him untouchable. But somewhere in Carriage 7, a quiet countdown has already begun. Set in motion by a turned railwayman and two strangers posing as a married pair of engineers. Petrov shuts his compartment door, locks it, and vanishes into the rhythm of steel and snow. By tomorrow, one body will be found, one briefcase won't, and the world will tilt on Operation Silent Track. Viktor Petrov was born in 1938 in Leningrad. 4 years before the siege that would starve 1 million people and forge a generation's understanding of survival. His father disappeared during the purges when Viktor was 6. No arrest, no trial. Just an empty chair at breakfast and a mother who stopped saying his name aloud. The lesson carved itself into Viktor's spine before he could articulate it. The state decides what is true, and truth is whatever keeps you breathing. His formative moment came in 1961. Petrov was 23, newly recruited into the Committee for State Security, assigned to internal counterintelligence in Moscow. A colleague, a man named Sokolov, 12 years Petrov's senior, failed to report a contact with a suspected Western agent. The contact was innocent. Sokolov had documentation. It didn't matter. Within 72 hours, Sokolov was gone. Not arrested, not imprisoned, erased. His wife and 2 children were relocated to Siberia under different names. The apartment was reassigned. Personnel files were redacted. Petrov attended a briefing where his supervisor explained, with the calm of someone discussing crop yields, that Sokolov had never existed in any meaningful sense. Petrov learned the KGB's operational theology that week. Loyalty supersedes truth, and the appearance of control matters more than actual security. By age 27, he had developed his defining skill: compartmentation, the surgical art of moving sensitive material through Soviet bureaucracy without leaving fingerprints. He didn't need to threaten. His reputation did the work. Doors opened because people imagined what happened if they didn't. By 1983, Petrov occupied a position that didn't appear on organizational charts. He was a specialist in denial operations, ensuring that when the Soviet state moved its most sensitive intelligence products, no one outside a circle of 6 people knew the route, the cargo, or the destination. His methodology was elegant. He traveled alone, carried documents that meant nothing without context held elsewhere, and moved through Soviet infrastructure like blood through veins. Invisible, essential, protected by the system itself. When he boarded the Trans-Siberian on August 7th, he believed the fortress was unbreachable. The train was Soviet soil. The route passed through military zones. Every passenger was documented. Every carriage had oversight. The locked compartment door wasn't just physical security. It was ideological armor. In Petrov's calculus, the West couldn't touch him here. They wouldn't dare. He was correct about the fortress. What he didn't understand was that the CIA wasn't planning to breach it. They were planning to inhabit it. In early 1983, American intelligence doctrine was dominated by a concept called routine exploitation. The theory was straightforward. Fortresses have guards, but they also have janitors. High-security facilities run on schedules. Human beings get tired. Bureaucracies optimize for efficiency, not paranoia. The CIA's Directorate of Operations had spent the previous 18 months identifying leverage points inside Soviet civilian infrastructure where operational tempo created predictable gaps in oversight. The logic was clinical. Don't fight the system. Study it until you find the moments when the system contradicts itself. Then exploit the contradiction before anyone notices it exists. Petrov's Trans-Siberian route created exactly such a contradiction. The journey from Moscow to Irkutsk covered 5,200 kilometers and required 4 days. Soviet security protocols treated the train as mobile sovereign territory. Armed guards, compartment checks, passenger manifests reviewed at every major station. But the protocols assumed threats came from outside. They didn't account for threats already embedded in the routine. 3 obstacles defined the operational problem. First, Petrov traveled with controlled access, a private compartment, a locked briefcase, and authorization that made him functionally untouchable to anyone below a certain rank. Second, the environment was hermetically closed. This wasn't neutral ground. Every kilometer of track was USSR territory. Extraction was impossible. Third, anything physical, documents, equipment, bodies, could become evidence. The operation required a method that left no forensic signature the KGB could trace back to Western intelligence. CIA planners identified one narrow window. Petrov's route, carriage assignment, and transfer schedule aligned for a 6-day period in early August. After that, new Soviet security procedures would rotate personnel, alter routes, and eliminate the predictable gaps the operation required. The directive authorizing execution came from Langley on July 28th. Operational codename, Silent Track. Mission objective: separate Petrov from the briefcase without triggering a manhunt before the documents could be analyzed and the intelligence chain exploited. The triggering event was a signals intercept captured by NSA Station Berlin on July 19th. An internal KGB communication indicated Petrov would be transporting updated naval coordination protocols between Moscow and Pacific Fleet headquarters. The protocols weren't nuclear codes. They were something more tactically valuable. Coordination keys that allowed Western intelligence to predict Soviet submarine movements in the North Pacific for the next 6 months. The documents represented leverage, the ability to anticipate, to position assets, to turn the board without the Soviets knowing the game had changed. But there was a secondary calculation. Intercepted communications revealed something else. Petrov had a daughter. She was 16. She played violin. Analysts noted nothing operationally relevant. In a transcript from July 9th, Petrov mentioned her upcoming audition for the Moscow Conservatory. He sounded proud. When the operation concluded, the intercept would remain classified for 40 years. The daughter would learn nothing. That was the deal. Authorization for Silent Track included one additional constraint: no visible violence. Nothing that would allow Soviet counterintelligence to frame this as an act of war. The method had to look like something the USSR could accept: medical emergency, accident, internal failure. Plausible deniability wasn't for Western governments. It was for the Soviets. Give them a story they could live with, and they wouldn't escalate. By August 3rd, all elements were in position. 2 operatives had entered the Soviet Union 6 weeks earlier under deep cover. Asset Lantern had received his final instructions. The briefcase's route had been mapped. The margin for error was 18 hours. After that, the window closed. The operation was built on a foundation of profound mundanity. Operational success required becoming the kind of people no one remembers meeting. 2 CIA operatives traveled under identities constructed over 14 months. Cover names: Mikhail and Elena Sokolov. Official documentation listed them as mid-level civil engineers reassigned from Sverdlovsk to a dam project outside Ulan-Ude. Their work history was real, borrowed from 2 actual engineers who had transferred south 3 years earlier and whose bureaucratic ghosts still floated through Soviet record-keeping. Mikhail's father had been a mid-ranking party functionary in Ukraine. Elena's mother taught secondary school. Their marriage was 7 years old. They had no children. The story was designed to be forgettable. Their luggage contained technical manuals on concrete reinforcement, a chess set with half the pieces missing, 2 changes of clothes, and a bottle of Armenian brandy purchased in Moscow. Nothing was performance. Everything was infrastructure. The brandy was real brandy. The technical manuals had been read. The clothes had been worn. If searched, the Sokolovs would produce exactly what they appeared to be: tired professionals in a system that ground people down with reassignments and paperwork. The third component was more fragile. Asset Lantern was a railway conductor named Grigory Marchenko, age 49, recruited 9 months earlier in Novosibirsk after a financial audit revealed he'd been supplementing his income by facilitating minor black market exchanges, scarce goods moving along the rail corridor in exchange for cash or favors. The agency hadn't blackmailed him. They'd made him a better offer. 2,000 American dollars deposited in a Finnish account, accessible after retirement. In exchange, routine information: which doors got checked, which officials drank, which protocols were enforced versus which were theater. Lantern's value wasn't heroics. It was pattern recognition. He knew the Trans-Siberian's circadian rhythm. When staff rotated, when security became procedural rather than vigilant. When a 5-minute delay in a corridor inspection was normal versus suspicious. His instructions for Operation Silent Track were surgical. Create micro delays in oversight, ensure specific officials were occupied during a 12-minute window, and file paperwork that would obscure the timeline if anyone audited the route later. Communication discipline was absolute. No radio traffic, no encoded messages. The team used timed check-ins based on mundane actions visible to surveillance, but meaningless without context. Mikhail purchasing a newspaper at a specific kiosk meant Phase 1 complete. Elena visiting a restroom at a designated station signaled the window was open. If anything failed, the operation collapsed back into cover with no trace. The objective was framed in clinical language: separate Petrov from the documents without triggering a security response before Irkutsk station. How this was accomplished remained compartmentalized until execution. August 7th, 1983. 1400 hours. Yaroslavsky Station, Moscow. The Sokolovs boarded carriage 6, directly adjacent to Petrov's carriage 7. They carried their luggage without assistance. Elena smiled at a conductor. Mikhail dropped a technical manual and picked it up slowly, glancing down the corridor. No one noticed. That was the point. Petrov boarded at 1420 hours. He moved through the platform like a man accustomed to invisible deference. 2 officials accompanied him to his compartment, verified his credentials, and departed. The door closed. The lock engaged. Within 8 minutes, the train was moving. The approach phase required psychological precision. The Sokolovs didn't hunt Petrov. They let his habits expose him. Petrov's operational behavior was built on threat assessment. He evaluated everyone: posture, eye contact, baggage, conversation patterns. He looked for anomalies. People trying too hard to blend in. People watching when they should be bored. People whose stories didn't match their clothes. The CIA's counter was to do the opposite of espionage. They were boring. They bickered quietly about the damn project. Elena read a novel. Mikhail worked on engineering calculations and sighed frequently. They were tired in the specific way Soviet professionals were tired in 1983, worn down by systems that demanded compliance without offering meaning. Complications emerged within 6 hours. Uniformed security presence increased after departure. Passenger manifests were checked twice at the first major stop. A militiaman walked the corridor at unpredictable intervals. The heightened attention wasn't targeted at Petrov. It was ambient paranoia, the kind that followed any VIP transport. But it narrowed the window. The second problem was behavioral. Petrov changed his rhythm. He skipped the dining car, minimized corridor time. His compartment became a sealed environment. He emerged only for brief trips to the restroom, always during high traffic periods when the corridor was supervised. The man understood operational security instinctively. During the first night, Elena experienced what handlers call legend drift. Lying in the narrow bunk, listening to the train's rhythm, she found herself thinking about the dam project as if it were real. She visualized the construction site, imagined conversations with engineers she'd never met. The false identity felt more solid than her actual name. In the post-operation psychological assessment, this would be noted as a dissociative episode consistent with deep cover stress. But the mission continued. The window opened on the second night, August 8th, approaching Omsk. 2200 hours. The train's ecology shifted. Staff rotations left gaps. Passengers settled into sleep rhythms. Attention became procedural. This was the moment Lantern had identified weeks earlier, the point where routine replaced vigilance. Lantern's role became operational. At 22:30 hours, he misdirected a security sweep by reporting a minor issue in carriage 4, a door mechanism that needed inspection. 15 minutes of official attention diverted elsewhere. At 2300 hours, he filed paperwork indicating carriage 7 had been fully checked at the previous station. The document was bureaucratically correct and factually false. It gave the next shift supervisor permission to skip a compartment-by-compartment inspection. By 2340 hours, the corridor outside Petrov's compartment was empty. The militiaman was 3 carriages forward. The conductor was occupied with passenger complaints. The train was 2 hours from Omsk, moving through darkness and snow. Mikhail Sokolov stepped into the corridor. He carried nothing. His movements were calm. He knocked on Petrov's door 3 times, standard pattern for official business. What happened next took 11 minutes. The method exploited one fundamental vulnerability: Petrov's faith in the locked door. He believed physical barriers equaled security. The lock was Soviet manufactured, designed to withstand forced entry. It wasn't designed to prevent manipulation from someone with access to the carriage's master key system, access Lantern had provided. The door opened. Petrov was seated, briefcase on the small table. He looked up, saw Mikhail, began to speak. The Harshet technique was medical, a specific pressure point on the carotid artery. Applied correctly, it causes immediate unconsciousness without bruising. 30 seconds. Petrov slumped forward. Breathing continued. Pulse steady. The briefcase was secured to Petrov's wrist by a chain and padlock. Elena entered the compartment carrying a medical kit. Inside, lock-picking tools disguised as medical instruments. The padlock opened in 90 seconds. The briefcase was transferred to a duplicate case of identical external appearance, but different internal contents. Technical reports on water infrastructure that would pass cursory inspection but contain nothing of intelligence value. The original briefcase moved through the corridor to carriage 6. It would be disassembled, the documents photographed, the pieces distributed across multiple bags. By Irkutsk, no single passenger would be carrying anything that looked like classified material. The critical decision came next. Petrov could not wake up and report penetration. The operation's success required his silence. Permanent silence. The method was chemical. a compound that mimicked cardiac arrest. Administered correctly, it was undetectable in a standard Soviet autopsy. The substance entered Petrov's system through a minor injection site beneath his collar. Time to effect, 6 to 9 minutes. The compartment door was locked from inside. Mikhail and Elena returned to their own space. At 00:48 hours, approximately 40 minutes after intervention, Viktor Petrov's heart stopped. He was alone in a locked compartment. The scene suggested natural causes. A middle-aged man under professional stress, experiencing sudden cardiac failure. There was no struggle, no visible wounds. The briefcase was present, chained to his wrist as procedure required. The train continued east. By 0600 hours, a conductor discovered Petrov during a routine wake-up call for early disembarkation passengers. The door was locked from inside. Officials were summoned. The compartment was sealed. Medical assessment was immediate. Cardiac event. The body was removed at Omsk station. The briefcase accompanied the body. No one checked its contents immediately. It was evidence in a potential medical inquiry, not a security breach. The Sokolovs disembarked at Irkutsk on schedule. August 10th, 1400 hours. They carried their luggage, thanked the conductor, and merged into the station crowd. Their cover remained intact. Mikhail and Elena Sokolov continued to exist in Soviet records as engineers working on a dam project. They would file reports, collect salaries, maintain their legend for another 8 months before quietly transferring back west and disappearing into new identities. The documents, photographed, analyzed, and transmitted through a separate intelligence chain, reached Langley by August 14th. The briefcase's physical shell was destroyed. The contents provided 6 months of tactical advantage in the North Pacific and led to the compromise of 3 Soviet naval officers who were subsequently turned or neutralized. By 0900 hours on August 9th, KGB counterintelligence in Omsk understood that Viktor Petrov had died on Soviet sovereign territory under circumstances that made no operational sense. The investigation began with the compartment. Every surface was examined. No signs of forced entry. The lock was engaged from inside. The briefcase was present and secured. Petrov's personal effects were undisturbed. The medical examiner's preliminary assessment indicated cardiac arrest consistent with atherosclerotic heart disease. Petrov was 45 years old. He had no documented history of heart problems, but cardiac events were not impossible. The report was filed. The official narrative became medical misfortune. A dedicated officer succumbed to the pressures of his work. The death was tragic but explicable. The briefcase was returned to Moscow. Its contents were logged and filed. No one conducted a document-by-document verification against the original manifest. The assumption was that a locked briefcase chained to a dead man's wrist couldn't have been compromised. The assumption was incorrect. Privately, the response was different. A station chief in Omsk was reassigned to administrative duties in Vladivostok. The railway conductor who supervised Carriage 7 was questioned for 6 hours, released, and disappeared from his employment records 3 weeks later. New protocols were drafted. Compartment checks doubled. Lock mechanisms were upgraded. Bureaucracy multiplied because bureaucracy was how Soviet institutions processed failure, by adding layers that created the illusion of control. The strategic assessment took longer. By September, KGB analysts noticed anomalies in Western naval positioning. American submarines were appearing in locations that suggested foreknowledge of Soviet movements. The pattern was subtle, not dramatic enough to prove penetration, just consistent enough to raise alarms. An internal investigation was launched. It would run for 11 months, consume thousands of man-hours, and reach no definitive conclusions. The Soviets knew they'd been compromised. They couldn't prove how. The intelligence gained from silent track was tactically transformative. The naval coordination protocols allowed the U.S. Navy to predict Soviet submarine deployments with 82% accuracy over the following 6 months. 3 Soviet naval officers were identified as potential compromise points. 1 was arrested in a separate operation. 2 were turned. The cascade effects included repositioned American assets, preemptive diplomatic pressure, and strategic advantage in arms control negotiations that resumed in 1984. The operational cost was less quantifiable. Relations between the United States and Soviet Union were already adversarial. Silent track didn't change the temperature. It simply confirmed what both sides already believed, that the other was willing to kill to maintain advantage. The operation revealed tradecraft methods, specifically the penetration of civilian rail infrastructure. Soviet counterintelligence adapted. Future high-value transports moved by air or armored convoy. The railway became suspect territory. For Grigory Marchenko, asset lantern, the consequences were delayed. He continued his railway work, filed reports, moved through his routine. The $2,000 remained in the Finnish account. He never accessed it. In November 1984, during an unrelated audit, irregularities in his personnel file were flagged. He was questioned. The questions were procedural. He was released. 3 days later, he failed to report for his shift. His apartment was found empty. No body was recovered. The official explanation was voluntary departure. The realistic explanation was that someone in the KGB's second chief directorate had connected enough fragments to make Marchenko a liability. In Soviet intelligence culture, liabilities were resolved quietly. For Viktor Petrov's daughter, the outcome was a story she would never fully understand. She learned of her father's death on August 10th. The official cause was cardiac arrest. The funeral was private. She was told her father died serving the state. At 16, she had no reason to question the narrative. By 1991, when the Soviet Union collapsed and certain records became accessible to researchers, she had moved to Germany and changed her name. A journalist contacted her in 2006, asking about Operation Silent Track. She declined to comment. The transcript of her father discussing her violin audition remains classified. The CIA's internal assessment, completed in October 1983, framed Silent Track as a qualified success. The documents were acquired. The method was untraceable. Soviet responses indicated confusion rather than certainty. But the assessment included a warning. The operation had crossed a threshold. Killing a courier on domestic Soviet soil, even with plausible deniability, represented escalation. Future operations of this type would face higher risk of exposure and retaliation. The appetite for such methods would grow. And once intelligence services normalized silent killing in the name of strategic advantage, the mechanism for restraint eroded. The lesson spread through Western intelligence communities over the following decade. Trains, hotels, embassies, any space the target considered secure could become unsecured if routine was compromised. Security wasn't physical, it was psychological. And psychology could be weaponized. Was Viktor Petrov a legitimate military target or a civil servant murdered for carrying papers? The classification matters. International law in 1983 recognized combatants and non-combatants. Petrov wore no uniform. He wasn't on a battlefield. He was a courier on a train. One perspective argues he was an instrument of Soviet intelligence apparatus, actively engaged in operations that threatened American security. Neutralizing him was warfare by other means, surgical, necessary, and justified by the stakes. The intelligence gained prevented potential escalation. Lives were saved because one life was taken. The opposing perspective argues this was extrajudicial execution. No trial, no due process, no accountability. Petrov was killed because he held papers. The method was designed to leave no evidence, no investigation, no justice. The operation weaponized civilian infrastructure and treated an unarmed man as collateral in a conflict that had no declared front lines. The documents could have been acquired through other means. The killing was convenience masquerading as necessity. The paradox is structural. If silent track prevented conflict escalation, if the intelligence genuinely reduced the risk of miscalculation between nuclear powers, then one death purchased stability. But if the operation normalized methods that eroded legal and ethical constraints, then it poisoned the systems it claimed to protect. The answer depends on what you believe intelligence services exist to do. Prevent catastrophe at any cost, or operate within boundaries that preserve the legitimacy of the state. What's your take? If an operation produces tactical advantage but requires killing someone who will never face charges, never be named publicly, and never receive accountability, does the outcome justify the method, or does it corrode the principles the operation claims to defend? Drop your perspective in the comments.